Hello, and welcome to the darkness. I'm glad you could join me. Perhaps you're listening to this late at night, in a house that has finally fallen silent, the only light coming from your screen. If you're in America, the moon might be high in the sky, casting long skeletal shadows through your window. Or maybe you're on the other side of the planet, where the sun is just beginning to bleed over the horizon, and you've sought out this story as the world around you begins to wake. It doesn't matter. The time of day has no bearing on the chill that is about to creep into your bones. The story we are about to delve into is one that has waited over a century in the shadows, its questions unanswered, its wounds unhealed. It is a story that reminds us that sometimes the most profound evil doesn't happen in a sprawling, anonymous city, but in the quietest of places, behind a closed door on a peaceful street, in a town where everyone knows your name. So, settle in. Turn down the lights, if you dare. And if you find yourself drawn to the mysteries that history has tried, and failed, to forget, then consider subscribing to this channel. We have many more long nights to spend together, sifting through the dust of time for the tales that refuse to be buried. Tonight, we travel back to a place that was, for a fleeting moment, the heart of the American dream, before it became the setting of its most brutal and inexplicable nightmare. We are going to Villisca, Iowa, and we are going to knock on the door of a small white frame house that stands on the corner of East 2nd and 5th Avenue. A house where, on a warm summer night in 1912, something truly monstrous slipped inside and extinguished 8 human lives, leaving behind only a blood-soaked silence and a mystery that eats at the very soul of American crime history. This is the story of the Villisca Axe Murder House, Uundi. To stand the depth of the horror, you must first understand the peace that was shattered. Picture it. The year is 1912. The world is a different place. A world teetering on the edge of modernity, but still deeply rooted in the simple rhythms of the 19th century. In America, it is the age of Theodore Roosevelt's Bull Moose Party, of newfangled automobiles sharing dusty roads with horse-drawn buggies. It is a time of profound optimism, of faith in progress, community, and God. Nowhere was this truer than in the small farming towns of the Midwest, towns like Villisca. Nestled in the rolling hills of southwestern Iowa, Villisca was a portrait of pastoral tranquility. It was a railroad town, a hub of commerce for the surrounding farms, a place of about 2,000 souls. Its streets were lined with elm and oak trees. Its town square was a place for gossip and commerce, and its social life revolved around church events, school programs, and the simple pleasure of a neighborly chat over a picket fence. It was, by all accounts, a good place to live, a safe place, the kind of place where people didn't lock their doors at night. Because why would you? The only monsters in Villisca, they believed, were in storybooks. At the heart of this idyllic community lived the Moore family. They were the very embodiment of the town's values, hardworking, prosperous, and deeply involved in their church and community. Josiah B. Moore, known to everyone as JB, was 43 years old. He was a man who had made his own success. After working for years as a trusted employee at the Frank Jones Implement Store, he had struck out on his own, opening his own competing business, the Moore Implement Company. He was a formidable presence in the town's business circles, a go-getter, respected, perhaps even envied for his ambition and success. His wife, Sarah Montgomery Moore, was 39. By all accounts, Shasi. He was a loving mother and a pillar of the local Presbyterian church. Together, they had built a life and a family in their modest but comfortable home at 508 East 2nd Street. And what a family it was. They had 4 beautiful children, their lives still stretching out before them like an endless summer morning. There was Herman, the eldest at 11 years old, a boy on the cusp of his teenage years. Then came Catherine, just 10, whose world was filled with dolls and schoolyard games. Boyd at 7, and little Paul, the baby of the family at only 5 years old, filled the small house with the kind of noise and energy that turns four walls and a roof into a home. They were a well-known and well-liked family, a snapshot of the American dream taking root in the fertile Iowa soil. Nothing about them suggested they were living on borrowed time. Nothing hinted at the unimaginable violence that was waiting for them, just beyond the horizon of a single Sunday. That Sunday was June 9th, 1912. It was a warm, pleasant day, the kind that feels full of promise. The Moore family, like many of their neighbors, spent much of the day at the Presbyterian Church. It was a special day, the annual Children's Day program, an event Sarah Moore had helped to organize. The children had practiced their recitations, their songs, their little skits, for weeks. It was the culmination of their Sunday school year, a celebration of innocence and faith. As evening approached, the church was filled with the proud families of Villisca. The air was thick with the scent of summer blossoms and the sweet, high-pitched voices of children reciting scripture. J.B. and Sarah watched as their four children took their turn on the stage, their hearts surely swelling with a quiet, profound pride. Also in attendance were the Stillinger sisters, Ina, who was 8, and Lena, who was 12. They were the daughters of Joseph and Sarah Stillinger, who lived on a farm just outside of town. Lena was a close friend of Catherine Moore's. After the program, as families milled about, chatting and enjoying ice cream, the Moore children asked their parents if Ina and Lena could spend the night. It was a common enough request. A sleepover, a chance for the girls to whisper secrets into the late hours of the night. It seemed a harmless, happy end to a perfect day. Sarah Moore called the Stillingers to get their permission, which they readily gave. No one could have known that this simple, kind gesture, an invitation for a sleepover, was a death sentence. The Children's Day program ended around 9:30 p.m. The congregation slowly spilled out into the twilight of the Iowa evening. The Moore family, now a party of 8, began their walk home. It was a short walk, just a few blocks through the quiet, familiar streets of their town. We can imagine the scene. The children, high on sugar and excitement, running ahead, their laughter echoing in the still night air. J.B. and Sarah walking behind, perhaps holding hands, talking about the success of the evening, about the performances, about the simple good life they had built. They passed the homes of their friends and neighbors. They saw lights in the windows. They were surrounded by the comfortable, predictable rhythms of their world. Sometime between 9:45 and 10 p.m., the 8 of them, J.B. Sarah, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, Paul, and their young guests, Ina and Lena Stillinger, walked up the steps to their front porch, turned the knob on their unlocked door, and stepped out of the world of the living. They were never seen alive again. The house fell silent. The town of Villisca went to sleep, blanketed by the vast starry darkness of the rural night. The trains rumbled through on the nearby tracks, their lonely whistles a familiar lullaby. No one heard a scream. No one saw a thing. Inside the little white house on East 2nd Street, the clock ticked on, measuring out the final terrible hours of 8 innocent lives. Something was in that house with them. Or perhaps, something was waiting for them. The details of what happened next have been pieced together from the gruesome tableau that would be discovered the next morning. But the truth of it, the sequence of terror, the very heart of the event, remains locked away in the silence of that house. The killer, it is believed, waited. He may have hidden himself in the small barn behind the house, or perhaps in the shallow crawl space of the attic, listening as the family prepared for bed. He would have heard the children's excitement give way to sleepy yawns. He would have heard the parents' hushed voices as they moved through the house, checking on their children, turning down the lamps. He would have heard the creak of the bed springs as J.B. and Sarah finally retired for the night in their downstairs bedroom. And then, he would have waited for the deepest point of the night, that pitch-black hour just before dawn when sleep is heaviest, and the world is at its most vulnerable. His weapon was already in the house. J.B. Moore's own axe, which had been left in the backyard by the woodpile. The killer took it and entered the home, likely through the unlocked back door. He was methodical. He was patient. He was utterly without mercy. His first stop was the downstairs bedroom, where JB and Sarah Moore slept. He carried an oil lamp with him, its chimney removed to dim the flame, casting just enough flickering, hellish light to see by. He raised the axe. The first blow was to Josiah Moore's head. It was a blow of such incredible force that it crushed his skull and likely killed him instantly. He then turned to Sarah. She was struck again and again. The killer did not just kill them, he obliterated them, focusing his rage on their heads until their faces were unrecognizable. Then, with his bloody work complete in that room, he moved the Z through the silent house. He went upstairs. There, in one bedroom, slept the 4 more children. 11-year-old Herman, 10-year-old Catherine, 7-year-old Boyd, and 5-year-old Paul. The scene of domestic peace would have been transformed into one of abject horror. One by one, as they slept in their beds, he brought the axe down upon them. He moved from bed to bed, a phantom of death in the darkness, extinguishing their young lives with the same brutal efficiency he had shown downstairs. There is evidence that at least one of them, perhaps Herman, may have woken, may have tried to fight back. A defensive wound on his arm, a silent testament to a final futile moment of struggle against an incomprehensible evil. In the adjacent room, the 2 visiting Stillinger sisters, Ina and Lena, slept. They were guests in this home, innocents caught in a web of violence they could not have understood. The killer entered their room and repeated his gruesome task. Lena, the older sister, was found with a nightgown pushed up to her waist, and there was speculation of sexual assault, though the local doctor who first examined the bodies found no definitive evidence of it. She, too, had a defensive wound on her arm, suggesting she had raised it in a desperate, instinctual attempt to ward off the falling blade. Little 8-year-old Ina was killed in her sleep. 8 people, 6 of them children, were now dead. But the killer wasn't finished. What he did next elevates this crime from a simple, albeit horrific, act of murder into something truly bizarre, something that speaks to a deeply disturbed and ritualistic mindset. He went through the house and covered the faces of every single one of his victims with bedclothes. A sheet, a dress, a blanket, whatever was at hand. He then walked through the house and covered every mirror and every piece of glass with a piece of cloth, the error on Sarah Moore's dresser, the glass on the doors, all draped in fabric, as if he could not bear the thought of his own reflection, or perhaps, as if he feared the spirits of the dead could look out from them. He found a 2-pound slab of bacon in the icebox, carried it into the living room and left it on the floor, wrapped in a dish towel, propped next to the axe, which he had wiped clean but not entirely. He found a keychain on the floor and placed it next to the bacon. He took a plate of uneaten food from the kitchen table and a bowl of bloody water and left them in the same room. Then he went to the back of the house, to the kitchen, where he took a drink of water. Finally, before leaving, he locked the house from the inside. He locked the front door and the back door, and he took the keys with him. He then stepped out into the pre-dawn stillness, a ghost vanishing back into the world, leaving behind a house of death that was sealed like a tomb. The sun rose on Monday, June 10th, 1912. The new day brought with it the familiar sounds of a town waking up. Roosters crowed, milk wagons rattled down the streets, and people began to stir for another week of work. But on East 2nd Street, the Moore house remained unnaturally still. The curtains were drawn. The doors were shut. There was no sign of life. The first person to notice that something was wrong was their next-door neighbor, Mary Peckham. She rose early, around 5 o'clock a.m., to hang her laundry. She noted the eerie silence from the Moore's property. Usually by this time, Sarah would be up and about, starting the day's chores. The children would be making noise. But there was nothing. As the hours ticked by, her unease grew. By 7 o'clock a.m., she knew something was deeply, terribly wrong. The Moore family were creatures of habit, their routine as reliable as the sunrise. This profound silence was an aberration. She walked over to their front porch and knocked. There was no answer. She tried the door and found it locked. She went around to the back of the house, let their chickens out of the coop, and knocked again. Still, only silence answered. Worried, Mary Peckham called Josiah's brother, Ross Moore. Ross arrived a short time later, a knot of anxiety tightening in his stomach. He too knocked and called out for his brother. He tried to peer into the windows, but the curtains were drawn tight. After receiving no response, he produced his own set of keys to the house. He tried his key in the front door, and it turned. He opened the door and stepped into the parlor. The first thing he saw was the downstairs guest room, just off the parlor, where the Stillinger sisters had been sleeping. He pushed the door open. On the bed, he saw two small forms covered in blood-soaked sheets. He didn't go any further. He didn't need to. He backed out of the house immediately, stumbling onto the porch, his face pale with shock. "My God," he whispered to Mary Peckham, who was waiting anxiously on the lawn. "Something is terribly wrong. Get the marshal." The call went out to the town marshal, Hank Horton. What happened next was, by modern standards, a catastrophic failure of law enforcement. But in 1912 Villisca, it was simply a reflection of an era unprepared for such savagery. Marshal Horton arrived and entered the house. He saw the scene in the downstairs bedroom. He saw the bodies upstairs. He saw the covered mirrors and the strange, ritualistic items left behind. The horror was absolute. But as word of the tragedy spread through the town like a wildfire, a crowd began to gather outside the little white house. And in a decision that would forever compromise the investigation, the scene was not secured. Dozens, perhaps even hundreds, of curious and horrified townspeople were allowed to traipse through the house. They walked through the blood. They touched the walls. They picked up objects. They contaminated every square inch of the crime scene. It was a chaotic swirl of grief, fear, and morbid curiosity that effectively erased any chance of finding clean fingerprints, footprints, or any other physical evidence the killer might have left behind. The House of Death became a public spectacle. The state of the bodies was horrific. The town's doctor, F.S. Williams, arrived and conducted a preliminary examination. He determined that the murders had likely occurred sometime between midnight and 2 a.m. The weapon, the bloody axe belonging to Josiah, was found leaning against the wall downstairs. Every victim had been bludgeoned in the head. The ceilings above the beds of J.B. and Sarah, and above the children upstairs, were gouged and scarred, a chilling testament to the sheer force of the axe swings in the darkness. It was a slaughterhouse. The news spread beyond Villisca. Journalists and detectives descended on the small town. The search for the Villisca axeman had begun, but the investigation was already hopelessly crippled. With a lack of physical evidence, investigators had to rely on theories, on rumors, and on trying to understand the mind of a killer who could commit such an act. And in a small town gripped by fear and paranoia, theories and rumors were in plentiful supply. The finger of suspicion began to point in every direction, tearing at the fabric of the community, turning neighbors into strangers and friends into potential suspects. One of the first and most enduring theories centered on a powerful local figure, State Senator Frank F. Jones. Jones was a pillar of the community, one of its wealthiest and most influential citizens. Josiah Moore had worked for Jones for 9 years at his implement company before leaving to start his own, directly competing business. The professional rivalry was intense. JB had been very successful, taking a significant amount of business, including a lucrative John Deere dealership, away from his former employer. This, prosecutors would later argue, was a powerful motive for murder. But the rumors ran deeper and darker than just business. There was talk of a personal animosity, whispers of an affair between Josiah Moore and Frank Jones's daughter-in-law Donna, though no concrete evidence of this affair ever surfaced. The rumor was potent enough to fuel speculation that Jones, enraged by both the professional and personal betrayal, had hired a man to eliminate Josiah Moore and his entire family. The man allegedly hired by Jones was a drifter and occasional contract killer named William Blackie Mansfield. Mansfield was a sinister character, a man suspected of being a serial killer who had committed nearly identical axe murders of his own wife, infant child, and in-laws in Blue Island, Illinois, 2 years prior. He was also a suspect in the axe murders of a family in Paola, Kansas, just before the Villisca crime, and another in Colorado Springs, Colorado, a year after. The pattern was eerily similar. Entire families slain in their beds with an axe, the killer locking the doors and vanishing without a trace. A private investigator hired by a Burns detective, James Newton Wilkerson, became convinced of the Jones-Mansfield conspiracy. Wilkerson's investigation led to Mansfield being arrested in 1916. An alibi witness, however, swore that Mansfield was in Illinois at the time of the Villisca murders, producing a payroll record to prove it. The case against him was built on circumstantial evidence and coerced testimony. After a grand jury indicted him, the case ultimately fell apart, and Mansfield was released. He later sued for false arrest and won a settlement, walking free, though the shadow of Villisca would follow him for the rest of his life. The theory that the powerful Senator Jones had orchestrated the whole thing was tantalizing, but it could never be proven. It remained a dark stain on the town's history, a story whispered in hushed tones for generations. If Frank Jones was the town's high-profile suspect, then the Reverend George Jacqueline Kelly was its most bizarre and unsettling. Kelly was an English-born traveling minister who had arrived in Villisca just a few days before the murders. He was known for his strange, erratic behavior, his nervous energy, and his sermons, which were often laced with fire and brimstone. On the evening of June 9th, he had attended the Children's Day program, the very same event the Moores and Stillingers had attended. He left town on an early morning train at 5 o'clock a.m. on June 10th, just hours after the murders were believed to have been committed. What made Kelly a prime suspect was his own words and actions in the weeks and months that followed. He developed an obsessive interest in the case, writing numerous letters to investigators and family members, offering his own theories and seeming to know details that hadn't been made public. Years later, in 1917, he was arrested after confessing to the murders. His confession was a chilling, rambling account. He claimed that he had been walking past the Moore house late that night when a voice commanded him, "Go in and slay utterly." He described the murders in detail, claiming he was an instrument of God's wrath. But his story was inconsistent, and he soon recanted, claiming he had been coerced by relentless police interrogation. There were other strange pieces of evidence. A woman who had been a passenger on the same early morning train as Kelly claimed he had been agitated and had tried to push his way past her, muttering about saving a child from a terrible household. Another witness recalled seeing Kelly at the Children's Day program staring intently at the Moore family. And perhaps most damningly, a dry cleaner in a nearby town reported that weeks after the murders, a man he believed was Kelly had dropped off a shirt for cleaning that had what appeared to be bloodstains on the cuffs. The shirt was never recovered. Reverend Kelly was tried for the murder of Lena Stillinger. The first trial resulted in a hung jury, with jurors unable to agree on his guilt. He was tried a second time and was acquitted. The strange, wild-eyed preacher walked free, leaving behind another thick cloud of suspicion and another dead end for the tormented town of Villisca. Beyond these named suspects, there was another, perhaps more terrifying possibility, that the killer was a complete stranger, a phantom who drifted into town on the railroad tracks, committed an act of unspeakable violence for reasons known only to himself, and then vanished back into the vast, anonymous expanse of America. This theory gained traction as investigators began to connect the Villisca murders to a string of other, similar unsolved axe murders that had occurred along railroad lines throughout the Midwest. From Colorado to Illinois, families were being wiped out in their sleep in a chillingly similar fashion. Was it possible that a single man, a transient serial killer, was riding the rails, leaving a trail of butchered families in his wake? One name that surfaced in connection with this theory was Henry Lee Moore. no relation to the victims. He was convicted of the axe murder of his own mother and grandmother in Missouri, several months after the Villisca killings. His weapon of choice and the brutality of his crime matched the Villisca case, and for a time, he was considered a strong suspect. But his timeline could never be definitively placed in Villisca on the night of June 9th. The idea of a nameless, faceless killer, a human monster moving silently from town to town, was in many ways the most horrifying theory of all. It meant that no one was safe. It meant that evil could simply arrive on the 5 o'clock a.m. train and then be gone with the dawn. The investigation devolved into a quagmire of accusations and counter-accusations. The town of Villisca, once a tight-knit community, began to eat itself alive. The supporters of Frank Jones squared off against the supporters of Reverend Kelly. Conspiracy theories bloomed like poison weeds. Families were torn apart by suspicion. The failure to find the killer left a gaping wound in the town's psyche. The murders weren't just a tragedy, they were a curse. Villisca became defined by its darkness. The idyllic town was gone forever, replaced by a place haunted by the ghosts of an unsolved crime. The years turned into decades. The witnesses grew old and died. The trails went cold. The files were shelved. But the little white house on East 2nd Street remained. It stood as a silent, decaying monument to the night that had stolen the town's innocence. For many years, the house was a private residence. Families lived there, raised children there, tried to make it a home, but the shadow of its past was long. Locals would cross the street rather than walk past it. Children would dare each other to touch the front door. Strange stories began to circulate. People who lived in the house reported hearing inexplicable noises at night, the faint sound of children crying, the creak of footsteps on the stairs when no one was there, doors opening and closing on their own. The house, it seemed, had not forgotten what happened within its walls. It was holding on to the memory, the trauma, the terror of that night in 1912. In 1994, the house was purchased, not to be lived in, but to be preserved. It was restored to its 1912 condition, its grim history now its sole reason for being. The Villisca Axe Murder House was open to the public for tours and, for the truly brave, overnight stays. It was at this point that the house's reputation shifted from that of a historical crime scene to one of America's most active and terrifying haunted locations. The whispers of the past became a roar. Thousands of people have now walked through that house, from curious tourists to seasoned paranormal investigators, and their stories are remarkably consistent. They speak of a heavy, oppressive atmosphere that settles on you the moment you step inside. They talk of sudden, inexplicable drops in temperature, of being touched or pushed by unseen hands. They report seeing objects move on their own, a ball rolling across the floor in the children's room, a closet door swinging open. The most common and most disturbing reports are the auditory phenomena. Visitors and investigators alike have captured countless hours of audio recordings, known as electronic voice phenomena, or EVPs. On these recordings, when played back, faint voices can be heard in the static, voices that were not audible at the time. Whispers that seem to answer direct questions. The most famous and chilling of these is a child's voice, clearly captured, saying, "Get out." The children's upstairs bedroom is considered by many to be the epicenter of the paranormal activity. People report hearing the distinct sounds of children's laughter and whispers, only to find the room empty. Toys left in the room are often found moved to different locations. Some have even reported seeing the fleeting apparition of a small child standing in the doorway, only to vanish when approached. The closet in this room is a particular focal point of fear. Many people, including hardened investigators, report feeling an overwhelming sense of dread and a malevolent presence emanating from it, refusing to even open the door. Downstairs, in the master bedroom where JB and Sarah were murdered, visitors have reported feeling a deep, inconsolable sadness. Some have claimed to see indentations appearing on the bed, as if someone unseen is sitting there. The living room, where the killer left his strange collection of items, is also a place of intense activity. People have seen the rocking chairs moving on their own, and have heard disembodied footsteps walking back and forth. The house's dark energy seems to have a profound and sometimes dangerous effect on the living. It preys on emotion, on fear. In November of 2014, the haunting legend of the house took a terrifying turn, bleeding back into the world of real-world violence. A paranormal investigator from Wisconsin was staying in the house overnight, alone. In the early hours of the morning, he called 911. Police arrived to find him with a self-inflicted stab wound to the chest. He claimed an unseen entity had commanded him to do it. He survived, but the incident served as a chilling reminder that the darkness in that house, whether it is a product of the human mind or something truly supernatural, is not passive. It is interactive, it is powerful, and it may be malevolent. What is it about this house? Why, after more than a century, does the tragedy still resonate with such power? Is it merely the unsolved nature of the crime that keeps the story alive? Or is something else at play? Paranormal experts theorize that a place where such a sudden, violent, and emotional event occurs can hold an imprint of that event. A residual haunting, like a recording played back on a loop. The sounds of crying, the footsteps, the terror, all permanently etched into the environment. But the reports from the Villisca house often suggest something more than a simple recording. They suggest an intelligent haunting. The voices that answer questions, the entities that seem to interact with visitors. These suggest that the spirits of the Moore family and the Stillinger sisters may still be trapped there, reliving their final moments, forever tied to the place where their lives were so brutally cut short. Or perhaps it is not the victims who linger there. Perhaps it is the killer. Perhaps the inhuman rage and malevolence that drove a man to commit such an act was so powerful that it, too, left a permanent stigma, and on the house, a dark, predatory energy that still waits in the shadows for the sun to go down. The little white house on the corner of East 2nd Street stands today as a testament to a perfect storm of human evil and historical tragedy. It is a place where a family's American dream was hacked to pieces, where a town's sense of safety was irrevocably shattered, and where the line between the past and the present, the living and the dead, seems to be impossibly thin. The doors are open, waiting for the next person brave enough to step inside and listen to the stories it has to tell. The axe may have fallen for the last time in 1912, but the silence it left behind still screams. The faces of the victims were covered by the killer, but their story, their tragedy, refuses to be hidden. It endures, a century-old question mark hanging in the dark heart of America. Who was he? Was it the scorned business rival, the crazed preacher, the rail-riding serial killer, or someone else entirely? Someone who lived in the town, who smiled at the Moors on the street, whose name was never even considered. We will likely never know. The identity of the Villisca Axeman is a secret that time has swallowed whole. All we are left with is the story, the house, and the 8 souls whose lives ended on a single, terrible night. Their justice was never found on this earth. And so, perhaps they still seek it from beyond, whispering their tale to anyone who will listen in the dark. What do you think happened in that house? Who do you think walked out of that front door on the morning of June 10th, 1912, leaving a tomb behind him? Was it a crime of passion, a contract killing, a random act of madness, or a ritualistic slaughter? The floor is yours. Leave your theories, your thoughts, and your feelings in the comments below. The story is no longer just Villisca's. It is ours now, a part of a dark history we try to understand. And if you crave the darkness, if you feel the pull of mysteries that linger in the shadows of time, be sure to subscribe and ring the bell for notifications. There are so many more doors to open, so many more stories waiting to be told. Until next time, try to sleep well. And perhaps, Just for tonight, check the locks on your doors.